Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. It's been a while since you've seen me, but I'm glad to be here with you tonight. And my guest, Bryce Greene. How you doing, Bryce?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I am well, all things considered. Bryce is a contributor to FAIR, which I know to stand for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And they are called Fair Media on Twitter. And he is also a recent graduate of Indiana University, where he is going to be doing his PhD in surveillance capitalism. Sounds like a very interesting project.
Yeah, I expect it will be.
Yeah. Well, you wrote an article in FAIR on March 4th, which was called "Calling Russia's Attack Unprovoked Lets the U.S. Off the Hook." Now, I have been seeing that term, unprovoked, every single time they use the phrase Russian invasion. It's almost like whenever they talk about Donald Trump's allegations that the 2020 election was stolen, they have to use the adjective baseless. It's like some memo came out to the corporate media. You must always say this is unprovoked. But you decided that you're going to write an article saying that that's not accurate. Are you a Putin puppet, Bryce?
uh, no, I'm not a Putin puppet. I am an American citizen, and I think first and foremost, if we care about the stability of the world, if we care about peace, then the first place that we need to look is our own government.
So talk about what you think the Russia or the U.S. or the West did to provoke Russia, and go back to the dissolution. In your article, you go back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, and you take us through the 2014 coup, which we had a big hand in. I did an entire show on this in 2019. And go through the Minsk Accords, which neither side seems to have honored.
Right, and so yeah, you're exactly right. I wrote this article because I was seeing so much of the corporate media talk about how this was completely unprovoked, out of the blue, and that there was nothing that could have been done to stop this madman from making a massive power grab, and that's just simply not accurate. If you look at the history, you'd see that Vladimir Putin has made a lot of hay about how he feels that his security concerns are not being taken into account by Western powers. And he's been concerned about Western powers, NATO in particular, brushing up and pushing up against Russia's borders, expanding NATO, putting missiles there, and having military bases and all that. And that has a long, long history, even before Putin was in power. If you go back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, one of the main deals that was part of the post-Cold War security structure was that the United States would agree not to expand NATO. I think the quote was not 1 inch east of East Germany, which was about to be reunified with West Germany. And that was widely understood to be the plan for a post-war security, where neither side would feel antagonized by the other, and there was no reason to expand a military alliance because this was supposed to be a time of peace. There was all this talk of a peace dividend and things like that, but America used its power in the world. It was a unipolar world for the first time. By that I mean that the United States was the sole superpower with the main role of enforcing its will around the world, and the United States chose to use that opportunity to expand NATO and expand its influence abroad, expand the military commitments from European countries. They added several different countries, despite the warnings of not only the Russians but their own people. One of the lead diplomats of the Cold War era, George Kennan, he was the architect of the Cold War strategy of containing the Soviet Union, and so he's no dove, he's no anti-imperialist, but he was pretty apprehensive about all this talk of NATO expansion. And in 1999, he was asked by the New York Times what he thought about it, And he said that, well, there's no reason to expand NATO because that would make Russia feel threatened, and they're going to have some sort of reaction, and it will have been completely avoidable. And he said that the people who want to expand NATO when Russia has a bad reaction, they'll say that this is how Russia was all along, and there's nothing you can do about it. But that's just wrong, he says. But despite this warning, we added like all these different countries in Hungary, Latvia, the Czech Republic, all of these countries slowly inching towards the Russian border. And repeatedly, the Russians and our own people, even after that, would say that this would lead to some sort of conflagration. Famously, Vladimir Putin gave a speech in Munich in 2007 talking about his exact security concerns, talking about how, well, yes, the Russia is sort of weakened now, but they still have these, legitimate concerns about whether or not there should be a hostile military alliance on its border. And the year after that, William Burns, who was the ambassador to Russia, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, he's now the CIA director, but he sent a cable to back home from Russia talking about Russia's red lines. The cable was called "Niet means Niet," Russia's NATO enlargement red lines, and he really echoed a lot of what Kennan said, a lot of what a lot of foreign policy thinkers at the time were saying, and that if we continue to expand NATO, specifically into Georgia and Ukraine, things could get violent and Russia could be forced to intervene. Specifically, on Ukraine, he was talking about using the divisions in Ukrainian society because they are torn between, Western influence and Russian influence. But he said that if we exploit those divisions, as was the plans for many years, if we exploit that and try to wrest Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence to the U.S. sphere of influence, those divisions could erupt into a violent civil war, and Russia would be forced to intervene. And he ends it by saying that this is a decision that Russia does not want to have to make. But again, the U.S. continued to try and push them to make that decision, to try and push Ukraine into the U.S. and Western sphere of influence. And so over time, you've seen NATO start having closer military integration with them, having closer economic integration with the Western economic sphere. And all of this came to a head in 2014 when there was the Maidan coup or revolution, depending on how you look at it. I tend to call it a coup for the reasons I'll go into. But that whole thing started when the elected president of Ukraine, President Viktor Yanukovych, he had the choice between adopting a pro-Western economic package, complete with IMF loans and also the IMF structural adjustment that came with it, or take a Russian economic package, which had far fewer strings. And par for the course for the IMF, a lot of the strings that in this pro-Western package, they included things like cutting the health and education sector, which was, the largest employing public sector in Ukraine, getting rid of wage controls, and especially getting rid of capital controls and getting rid of like heat subsidies for their people. And all of this would be to sort of privatize the economy, to make it safe for Western investors and make it a lucrative market for Western capital. The Russian package had far fewer strings. There was a bit of a stick. If Yanukovych had gone with the IMF package, there would have been some light trade restrictions. But Yanukovych ended up going with the Russian package, and then immediately after that, protests rocked the country, and they were supported in part by the United States and the National Endowment for Democracy. And for those of you who don't know, the National Endowment for Democracy is it's sort of misnamed, obviously, because it functions as one of the State Department's regime change arms. The Washington Post described it as doing what the CIA used to do in private, but only in public. In other words, they're pumping money into civil society organizations, media organizations, and opposition groups in order to help push the country's political spectrum closer to the Western orientation. And so these groups, funded by the NED and a lot of private a lot of private pro-regime change advocates. They poured money into these protests, and these protests culminated in the ouster of Yanukovych in an unconstitutional maneuver.
Yes,
Um,
and I might also say that they spent $5 billion on this effort. The U.S. put $5 billion into this regime change operation over time. And what I did my show on with Kevin Zeese, the late great political activist, he died tragically last year, was about Victoria Nuland and how she was Hillary's. She was head of the Eurasian desk of the State Department, and she was the one who wanted this guy Yats, who ultimately became the president. He said, Yats is our guy, and put him in. Also put in the prime minister and put in the finance minister. I'll put a link to that show into the comments because it's pretty interesting. Kevin had a lot of details about how the finance minister was American. She wasn't even a Ukrainian citizen. And one of the first things they did when they made her prime finance minister was to give her citizenship. So the whole thing was just like what we did with Yeltsin, Yanks to the rescue, Time magazine called it, when we sent in our advisors to run Yeltsin's campaign, and then we have the nerve to talk about Russia interfering in our elections when we ran his campaign. Anyway, go on.
No, you're exactly right. And the thing about Victoria Nuland is that she is a longtime regime change advocate. She was Dick Cheney's foreign policy advisor, and her husband, Robert Kagan, was one of the founders of the Project for a New American Century, one of the major neocon think tanks, or yeah, they were a think tank that sort of sketched out the Bush administration's plan for essentially world domination, capturing or invading all these different countries in the Middle East. And so Nuland comes out of that ideological background. And the reason we know that she had such a large hand in restructuring the Ukrainian government is because about 3 weeks before Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown, there was a leaked phone call, leaked by an anonymous party, assumed by many to be Russia. But the leaked call was between her and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. And this is where they are talking about who should be outside of the government, who should be in the government. They're trying to get these far-right leaders, Oleg Tani. I'm very bad at pronouncing that name, but one of the major far-right leaders. She said that he needed to be talking with the prime minister, 4 times a week in regular meetings, just to have a closer integration between these two parts of the Ukrainian political body. And so this was 3 weeks before Yanukovych was overthrown, and 3 weeks before. So you have United States government officials picking the next government of Ukraine. And immediately after the overthrow, that new government came in. And one of the first things they did was to adopt that IMF package that Viktor Yanukovych had rejected. The loan amount, I believe, was $28 billion. And along with all these structural adjustment programs that came with it, like they cut heating subsidies and things like that. And so you can really see that this was primarily a push to get Ukraine into the Western economic and military orbit.
Yes.
Because now
also, I'm sorry. Also, we made them take Monsanto GMOs, where they had a pristine, organic agriculture sector there, and we made them ruin it with Monsanto GMOs and Roundup, glyphosate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, like this was a major victory for U.S. capital and Western investors who had been eyeing Ukraine for years. In fact, the head of the National Endowment for Democracy once described it as the quote biggest prize in like this East-West rivalry. But the thing about Ukraine is that, as I said earlier, the Russians consider that to be a major strategic asset. So not only was pouring money into this country with the goal of changing its politics, not only was that a provocative act, but this overthrow was an extremely provocative act because it sort of spat in the face of long-held Russian concerns that were understood by both Russians and United States officials. But they threw that out the window in order to uh, get more markets for Western capital. And as a result of this overthrow, there was a large-scale rebellion in the east. And the eastern Ukraine, they have closer ties to Russia. They're geographically closer. And they favored closer Russian integration. They favored this Russian integration package. And they voted for Viktor Yanukovych in large numbers. And when Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown, well, they felt like they were being left out of the picture. And so there were, protests that grew into, a large scale, like independence movement. But these were brutally suppressed by the Ukrainian military. And at the vanguard of this suppression were far right. I'll call them neo-Nazi extremists because they, quite frankly, are. They carry Nazi flags, they carry Nazi patches, and they were at the vanguard of not only the protests that overthrew Yanukovych, but also of this repression campaign against the pro-secessionist rebels in the East. And so that grew into a civil war, and eventually Russia sent in volunteers. I know they denied it, but they absolutely did. And that sort of helped the conflicts congeal into a stalemate. It was an uneasy one, but there were two agreements that came out of this stalemate. They were called the Minsk Accords, Minsk I and Minsk II. Minsk II is the relevant one because what it did was it allowed for a pathway to reintegrate these territories in the Donbass region into the Ukraine formal governing structure, but it would also give them a limited degree of autonomy. And this was agreed upon by France, Russia, United States, and of course Ukraine. But it was agreed to, but it was never really implemented. The Ukrainian government really dragged their feet on getting this, getting a bill through their parliament that would actually address these sort of autonomy concerns, get free and fair elections into that region. And at least one analyst that I quoted in my article, he believes that the main reason for them not doing this was that any sort of agreement that would allow that eastern region significant autonomy would also give them a veto power over joining NATO for Ukraine to join NATO, and that's something that the Ukraine government didn't want to accept. Additionally, they seem to have wanted to take it back militarily. There was always low-level fighting going on the ground in that region, and there has been for 8 years, but there was never really any push for any peaceful settlement. And the United States, who now had a significant degree of influence in the Ukrainian government after the overthrow, they refused to pressure Ukraine to implement the Accords, to hurry them up. Russia, for their part, they seemed to be largely supportive of the Minsk Accords, and they were largely supported by the fact that Putin refused to recognize these republics, and they definitely wanted recognition, as official countries. But Putin refrained from that, and he didn't do it until right before the invasion. And so this is where we go into all of these. When we look at all these forces put together, we look at NATO expansion. We look at the United States blatantly ignoring obvious Russian security concerns, ignoring their own diplomats, their own experts in the region, in favor of an expansionist policy, in favor of overthrowing governments, in favor of using their soft power to antagonize the Russian sphere of influence, then I think that calling that invasion unprovoked it doesn't capture the full gravity of the U.S. policy in that matter. And there's every reason to believe that the United States expected this war to happen. And there's every reason to believe that they still want it to continue.
Well,
if we look at the track record on the negotiations, which we can go into,
yeah.
The United States clearly does not have an interest in peace here.
Right. Okay. Okay, I want to get into that a little bit later, but first I want to go back to something you said, and it was in your article. Please explain to the people why it is very important militarily, as far as the mutually assured destruction aspect of things, that Ukraine not be admitted to NATO.
Right. So part of what NATO means is that you'll have U.S. military bases and U.S. missiles in your territory. And one thing that Putin has been very clear that he's concerned about is that if missiles were placed in Ukraine, they would be within like 5 to 7 minutes from Moscow. And that would undermine any sort of early warning system that Moscow could have, and it would destroy what's called a second strike capability. The whole security apparatus of the post World War II world is based on this theory of mutually assured destruction. That is, if a great power attacks another great power with nuclear weapons, that other power will be able to retaliate before those other weapons hit, thus ensuring that everyone will die. And it's ostensibly a deterrent to any sort of escalation on that scale. If U.S. missiles were placed that close to Moscow, then that would undercut that entire unspoken agreement. It would allow the United States to have first strike capability without the Russians having an ability to respond. Now, that would severely undermine Russia's security for obvious reasons. No nuclear power would tolerate that. This is what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba that close to Washington, that close to the United States border, well, the United States obviously freaked out. But that was handled a lot more gracefully than this was. Clearly, Kennedy and Khrushchev, they actually wanted to come to an arrangement. The only one who was talking about negotiations, who was seriously doing negotiations in this case, was Putin. In the months before the invasion, while the U.S. intelligence was, talking about how the raising alarm about this Russian troop buildup, Putin was absolutely clear about a path to de-escalation. He said that Ukraine should not be allowed to join NATO, and that we need to talk about these missile placements because we also have them in Poland and Romania, and that's too close for comfort for Putin already. And adding them to Ukraine would be another provocative measure.
Right.
And so the United States, they heard these demands, and they were like, they said that they'll talk a little bit about the missiles, but they didn't talk about the core of the issue, which was the fact that NATO kept expanding and that they wanted to push up against Russia's borders. And the Russians were, appreciative of the U.S. overtures about the missiles. And there seemed to be a signal that there would be another unwritten agreement that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO for an unspecified period of time. But obviously, the Russians had read their history books, and they know that unwritten agreements aren't the best way to do policy with Washington. Even written agreements are pretty iffy with Washington these days. Just ask Iran. But that wasn't enough for Russia. And so when Russia recognized these independent republics, the U.S. response was to completely cut off negotiations and to start talking about ramping up sanctions. And this was before Russians had stepped foot in Ukraine. Yeah. And so if James Risen's reporting is accurate, and if Putin did indeed make this decision in the last minute to invade, well, that would fall on a timeline right when the United States cut off negotiations and refused to talk further on those security concerns that, again, I have to stress, were understood by Western experts and were understood by the Russians and were reiterated for years and years and years.
And were perfectly reasonable. And when I was calling them perfectly reasonable, even before the invasion, I got such pushback from people. And I want to talk about this a little bit later, how so many liberals and even progressives, I make a distinction between liberals and progressives, are supporting, the propaganda that we're getting nonstop in the mainstream corporate media. Speaking of which, you referred to the neo-Nazis. I want to talk a little bit about them because, they're trying to say that Putin is a raving lunatic and that his his idea of denazifying the Ukraine is insane. There's no Nazis in Ukraine. Or, yes, there's Nazis, but there's Nazis in every country. They're not really an issue. Or then they say, but the Svoboda party only got 2% in the last election. Well, that may be true, but the neo-Nazis in our country are not intentionally put into our armed forces in the way that they are in Ukraine. And, Robert Parry, who I have to say, another late, great human being who founded Consortium News, he was a great mainstream media reporter who broke a lot of the Iran-Contra-Gate stories. But as soon as he started going up against the U.S. narrative, he was ousted from, ever being able to write for mainstream papers again, which is why he started Consortium News. Same thing with Chris Hedges, same thing with Cy Hirsch, same thing with Robert Scheer, same thing with Phil Donahue, who lost his show on MSNBC when he started speaking out against the Iraq war. So this is what happens. You get these great journalists, and as soon as they deviate from the party line, you no longer see them in the mainstream media. And
this is what we call free press.
This is what we call free press, but I call them stenographers for the corporate and imperialistic state. So basically, Robert Parry wrote an article that was just reprinted in Consortium News. He wrote this back in 2015, in which he railed against the New York Times for writing this glowing article about these neo-Nazis and never mentioning the term neo-Nazi or the term fascist, basically called them a volunteer unit. Apparently 300 of our military advisors came in and trained them first at that point in time. And so now you have groups like Meta, which is what Facebook was just renamed. They had a ban on ever promoting the Azov Battalion or writing about them. And now they're allowing people to write about them because apparently they're the good guys, It's like the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And there's a lot of danger right now in all these weapons going over to them. And I wanted to ask you about, well, first of all, let me go back because I'm skipping ahead into the order of the things that I wanted to talk about. So basically, you answered the question that I was going to ask you about with this intelligence saying they were going to invade, and all of us on the left saying, oh, they're not going to invade, and then they invaded. And so I was going to ask you why you think Putin did it, and you just said you thought because of this final, insult where they didn't agree to what he wanted, and then they started imposing the sanctions.
Well, there was one other thing that happened, and some people downplay it, but I also think it is a major signal. Zelensky, he started talking or signaling in vague terms that he might try and get Ukraine to be a nuclear state. He was talking about how the agreement that would ban like nuclear non-proliferation in Ukraine, he was saying that was contingent on Ukrainian security guarantees. But since no one's holding up that end of the bargain, well, then it might be time to rethink that. And so that was a signal to a lot of people that he was thinking about getting nuclear weapons. Now, that's clearly just provocative. That's clearly a threat. There are varying degrees to which people think that he was serious about it or whether that's even feasible. But it sent a clear signal to Moscow, in my view, that their security concerns were the last things on these people's minds.
Okay, so if we understand why Putin did it when he did it, and if we understand that the U.S. was so sure this was going to happen, why did they let it happen? All these advisors and strategists, including, you didn't mention Henry Kissinger, also knew that this was a line in the sand for Russia. Why do you think? I have my theories of why we did it. You said earlier you thought we wanted this war. Why do you think we wanted this war?
Well, back in late December, I caught this article in the Wall Street Journal written by John Denny. And Denny is like a researcher at the Atlantic Council, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically NATO's de facto think tank.
Yeah.
And this article, it was called, chillingly, it was called "The Strategic Case for Risking War in Ukraine." And in this article, he lays out his reasoning why the United States should not negotiate with Russia regarding their concerns about Ukraine and NATO and things like that. He said that the West should hold a hard line because one of two things would happen. Either Putin will back down or he'll go to war. And both of those things, he argued, are beneficial to the United States. If Putin were to back down, well, that would make him look weak. It would make the U.S. look strong, and it would, alter the geopolitical balance in Ukraine because, when a great power backs down from a bold posture while gaining nothing, well, then that severely undermines their own power on the world stage. And so that would have been great for the United States. But if he went to war, on the other hand, that would also be good for the United States. And he gives three reasons why. He says, A, it would forge a pro-NATO, anti-Russian consensus across Europe. And this is really important because, over the last several years, especially during the Trump years, people were asking questions about whether or not NATO was relevant. People were asking whether or not we need this military alliance that's a Cold War relic, and that costs a lot of money, and a lot of people don't pay their fair share. People were asking, like, do we really need this? But a war with Russia in a major European country would forge that, pro-NATO consensus again. And that's sort of exactly what happened. You saw Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah, Germany, they funded their military more than they ever have. And that was overnight. One of the other reasons that he said that war would be good was that it would give the U.S. the opportunity to impose crushing sanctions on the Russian economy. And again, that's exactly what we're seeing. Part of U.S. foreign policy is based on, competition between economic powers. We have China, and we hear a lot of anti-China rhetoric, and you have Russia, who is they also sit outside of this U.S. dominated economic system. And by virtue of that, their existence outside of that system, they're a threat to U.S. economic interests. And so being able to sanction Russia, in fact, I heard Biden say deindustrialize Russia. If we're able to do that, well, then that would take out a major competitor. And the last reason that he said, and this one is also kind of what's happening now, is that if Russia did invade Ukraine, well, that would give the U.S. the opportunity to fund an insurgency in Ukraine that would bog down the Russians and give them their own Vietnam. I think it's more accurate to call it their Afghanistan. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I called it a modern rendition of the Afghan trap, where, if you guys don't know, under Carter, we started under Carter, continued under Reagan, but the United States poured billions of dollars into these radical Islamic jihadists. We wrote them textbooks. We gave them weapons, anti-air weapons. We sent in military advisors. We funded these
supported Osama bin Laden.
Exactly. We supported them in order so that they would raise hell in Afghanistan, which was, in the Soviet sphere of influence at that time. And it would sort of draw the Soviets in to what he called the Afghan trap. And it would bog them down, and it would, destroy the Soviet Empire, which a version of that is exactly what happened. And even when asked about this, Brzezinski, he was like, well, what about the rise of Al-Qaeda? What about the Taliban? And his response, he was like, well, what's a few angry Muslims compared to the fall of the Soviet Union? And that was their idea of that. And that seems to be our idea with these radical Ukrainian nationalist neo-Nazis. We're sort of funding them so that, and we have, CIA trained militias, they're talking about it, to bog down the Russians in an insurgency should this war go on any longer or become an occupation. And so you take all of those reasons put together, that the U.S. has a strategic reason for pushing this war. And this is to say nothing about, the oil sector, the gas sector.
Yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I was, fighting fracking since 2012, and also fighting the Trans-Pacific Partnership since 2012. And that was Obama's push. He quadrupled fracking. A lot of people don't know that. It wasn't Texas oilman George W. Bush. It was Obama the
He bragged about it too.
fracking and bragged about making, the U.S. the largest. We exceeded Saudi Arabia in terms of the amount of oil that we produced. And, you frack for oil, especially in California, that's what you frack for, where I came from, and you frack for gas. But with gas, if you can't use it locally, you have to flare it into the atmosphere, which is methane. It's very bad. It's polluting, causes global warming, 86 times more potent than CO2. But he wanted to have, and the TPP would have expedited these LNG export terminals on both coasts to capture that gas, liquefy it, and send it to the coast to send it to, Europe on the East Coast and Asia on the West Coast. He was against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because, right now Germany gets about 40% of its gas from Russia. When 2 was going to come online, which it was completed and ready to go, which is the timing of that is interesting, then they would have gotten 80% of their gas. So this war not only serves the U.S. weapons manufacturers, but it also serves the U.S. fossil fuel companies that are now back to ramping up fracking because of this, shortage. So it really doesn't behoove us to start. And you and I talked on the phone yesterday about how we're making overtures to Venezuela, because they're the second largest oil producer and we want their oil, even though we never even recognized Maduro as the president. We were calling Juan Guaido the president. We fomented that coup, which didn't work out. And, England illegally froze their gold in London banks, and we held the assets of Citgo, which is a wholly owned subsidiary, U.S. subsidiary of the Venezuelan gas company. So I think there's a lot of reasons. Then, of course, Michael Hudson, and I'd like to get him on my show because he has a really interesting theory about, he wrote an article called "We Beat Germany for the Third Time," because he was saying that this unipolar world was starting to dissolve, with China and its Belt and Road Initiative and Russian, oil and gas. And like you said before, France and Germany thinking, what do we really need this NATO for? So there are just so many factors that, are the last things that are being told the American public, of course. But I'd like to ask you a question about why. So we see why Putin did it, but why do you think he didn't realize, or maybe he did, that there would be so much resistance from Ukraine and that maybe his own fighters, like we're starting to hear, and again, anything I read in the mainstream media, I don't know if it's true or if it's propaganda, but all those accounts of the young Russian soldiers saying, we didn't know that we were going to do this. Why are we doing this? Opposition in Russia. Why do you think, Putin, who's supposed to be such a great tactician, would go for this? We just discussed why, the U.S. would go for it. Why do you think he would go for it?
Right. It's really hard to get into, Putin's brain here. I was like you on the side of people who said that he wouldn't invade because it would give the United States everything they ever wanted. And that seems to be exactly what's happening now. Putin was talking before, or Putin's people they were talking about how they had sanction-proofed their economy to a certain extent. I don't know if that's been successful. You're reading about all these companies exiting. You're reading about the ruble crashing, but you're also hearing that some countries are still kind of beholden to Russian oil, and so they're not threatening as harsh of sanctions as they could be doing. Plus, they recently signed an agreement with China, and so China will definitely be buying some of Russian oil. But as far as consolidating a pro-NATO consensus, this seems to be like the exact opposite of what you would want to happen. And he does think, if you look at the peace treaties that have been leaking or that have been reported on, he's still talking about yes, you need to keep Ukraine neutral, We need to talk about these missiles. We need to talk about, recognize Crimea, recognize these independent republics. That's what he's still talking about. But for the foreseeable future, Putin's name is mud in European society. And in my view, this seems to be Putin's throwing up the table, so to speak, with the West. He's saying that there are no agreements to be made with these people. I think in one of his speeches, he called the United States the empire of lies, because there's just no way to seriously get negotiations going on. So in my view, it seems like he's turning on the West. He's throwing in his lot with China, who is obviously a rising superpower. And there are some measures that have been taken by other countries around the world that might give Putin an edge, namely Saudi Arabia. Last week, The Intercept reported that the Saudis have refused to not only answer calls from the Biden administration, but refused to increase production of oil in order to, get more oil pumping in these markets that are, starved of Russian oil, and try to get gas prices low. But the Saudis have decided to, continue at their current levels, which gives Russia a lot more leverage on the West. And so that's just one of the many international developments that might be going in Putin's favor. But as to his overall plan for the future, beyond just cutting ties with the West, I really can't. I have no idea. It doesn't look like that he will come out the major winner. One of the other things that happened was that that I just heard recently was that the U.S. took something like $300 billion in reserves, which is apparently, reportedly, something that they did not expect. Something that no one was talking about when they were talking about sanctions. This move was, surprising to
Reserves?
Russian economists and people like that.
Reserves of what? Money? Oil?
Yeah, money. $300 billion in reserves. Like this, sort of the same way that we've taken Afghan money. We've just said that that's ours now. In this case, Russia is actually being punished for something they did rather than something they didn't do. We're not invoking the victims of 9/11 to steal their money this time.
Yeah.
But this was something that Russia might not be able to easily replenish, might not be able to go on without. And so there might be unforeseen consequences. But like I said, I don't know exactly what could be Putin's long-term end game other than breaking from the West.
Yeah. Now the dangerous thing is, both of us are saying we don't know, and it's because censorship is so strong in both countries. I mean, in this country, they've taken off Russia Today, where my friend Lee Camp has had a long-running show. They've taken off Sputnik Radio, where my friend Jamarl Thomas has had a long-running show. I mean, these are not, Putin puppets. These are American leftists. They've also removed, apparently, Abby Martin's show, Breaking the Set, all 550 episodes from YouTube. I mean, this is where we find out about dissenting opinion, not just about Russia. And these people are hardly right about Russia. I mean, I've been on Jamal's show on Radio Sputnik several times, and I've never once mentioned the name Russia, nor has he. We're basically just talking about, what's happening on the left. Now, of course, in Russia, we know they've closed any kind of independent media they had left. Apparently, it's illegal to use the word war or invasion. There was something I saw on social media just earlier this evening about a Russian news editor who comes running across the back of a nightly news show, basically saying this is wrong. And for 7 seconds, until she got pulled off and then immediately arrested, she was risking, she knew what she was doing to basically tell the people, because that's what happens when you close off media or dissenting opinion, you manufacture consent. And this is a truly Orwellian situation. I mean, Matt Taibbi had a great Substack about it yesterday. And Unfortunately, this one is one of the ones that's not public, so I can't really share it in the comments. But it's just unbelievable. I mean, especially with our country, where we pride ourselves on freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of debate, to close off all this opinion. And now we see, like I mentioned before, liberals and even progressives, like, beating the war drums. I had a friend, a Bernie supporter, who was going to a Close the Sky rally in Santa Monica. I mean, this is no-fly zone means World War III. And yet they get caught up in, I don't know if it's the fog of war is the right expression, or just the, rally around the flag. But I mean, what we're seeing right now is Cold War. And I predicted this when Rachel Maddow started doing, Russiagate every night on her show for like the entire hour every night. What started out as something to explain Hillary's loss, I said, we got to watch out. And I said this at Ted Lieu's town hall, with Trump. I said, if you want to impeach him on the Monuments Clause, but not on this fake colluding with Russia BS. Because, we're getting another Cold War going here that could become a hot war. And now we see, 7 years, 7 years later, the fruits of that. And I'm very worried about, public opinion. And then the other thing that I want to say before I ask you to comment is, why do you think the American people are getting so concerned for the Ukrainians when this is happening at the same time with the Houthis in Yemen, with the Somalians, with the Afghanis, who basically, like you said before, we have taken their money, and now like 95% of them are starving. They've taken to selling their children for food, and the Palestinians, of course. I mean, is it because these other countries, the people are black and brown? Is it because these other countries were actually funding this? I mean, why do you think, or do you think just the propaganda, the people are just very susceptible, the average American, and they don't understand all this history, so they just believe wholesale, what they hear on the mainstream corporate media?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of those factors. Like you said, like the image of like a white country, white cities being bombed is striking for an audience that's used to seeing brown cities being bombed. They're a lot less able to say that this isn't us, like this isn't happening to us, so it can be out of sight, out of mind. And even with the May war in Gaza last year, that Israel fought, you would see the casualties mounting on the Palestinian side, but on cable TV there'd be pictures of like little Israeli children who they suffered. Like I don't remember the exact casualty numbers, but it was something. It was like an order of magnitude less than on the Palestinian side, and yet the Western media chose to focus on the white kids, just because that has the shock value for the American public. That's well known to anyone who runs a news station. They know that, and they exploit it. And it's also the fact that, like you said, if we were to seriously talk about these other conflicts, then we'd have to talk about the United States' role in those conflicts. And that's something that it seems that a lot of corporate media simply doesn't have the stomach for. They don't have the stomach for like talking about crimes when the crimes are committed by us. It's easy to talk about the crimes of enemies. It's easy to talk about the victims of official designated bad guys. But when we talk about the victims of the quote unquote good guys, well, then it requires asking tough questions. And the sort of cartoon narrative that we're being presented when we talk about Putin, he's another Hitler, wants to take over the world. That doesn't really work when we talk about our crimes, because we're obviously not Hitler, so we'd have to start asking tough questions, and so they don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And also, like it is a lot of it. What is that people want to be part of the team, and people want to be part of this. They like to think of America as truly crusading for democracy, and that's how this conflict has been sold to the American people. They've been told that that this is a contest between democratic Ukraine and Russian autocracy, and that this is the time for the West to, stand their ground in the face of aggression. And those narratives are really powerful to, Americans who've grown up in this sort of exceptionalist culture
Yep.
where, we're the best, where we're given a whitewashed version of history, where we are the good guys. The only problem is that has no basis in reality. And if we have a, screwed up, distorted view of history, then we're going to have a screwed up, distorted view of the present. And that's where this coverage comes in.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important. Like one of my favorite quotes, and I was a history major, is George Santayana, who said, "Those who don't understand history are condemned to repeat it." And that's exactly what we're doing. We've talked about some other wars. We didn't even talk about, Bosnia and Serbia and how there are parallels to that. We probably don't have time for that. There was also something I wanted to broach, we probably don't have time for, which is I know you're familiar with it, Domenico Lasorda, who is a famous Italian Marxist. He has a whole theory that what Russia is doing is not imperialist, as we're being told. It's the domino theory all over again. They cite, well, Putin made this speech, and he says that Lenin, one of the worst things Lenin did was make Ukraine independent, and one of the worst things, and he said over and over again that we want to recreate the Soviet Union. They bring up all this stuff. When in reality, according to a Marxist, what Putin is, he's really an anti-colonialist, because what we're trying to do is creep so far west, that we're going to, is it west or east? My geography. Well, go beyond Ukraine into Russia, that we're going to want to absorb Russia. And I think there was a time when Russia would have joined NATO, if I remember correctly.
In fact, in Putin's speech, he was actually talking about how in 2000, I believe, he asked Clinton if he could join NATO. He was like, this is something that, we might be interested in. But Clinton sort of laughed him off, and, we started funding Chechen rebels, on Russia's border, trying to destabilize the country. And so that was his answer. It was like, go away, and we're going to antagonize you. You're still the enemy.
Right.
There will be you're not European.
Yeah.
Like that seemed to be how it.
And to call him the new Hitler, when Russia was the one who helped us, stop Hitler, when they lost 27 million of their own people. I mean, it's just so outrageous.
It's such an effective rhetorical device. It gets people to turn their brain off. You'll see all these comparisons to World War II. You'll say, "Oh, well, we haven't had a ground war in Europe since World War II." Conveniently ignoring some important cases.
Right.
And then they'll talk about, how this is the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. But it's because World War II seems to be the only historical event that you can be sure that Americans have any sort of clue about. Even what they do know about it is, again, couched in this cartoon narrative.
Right.
That, good guys, bad guys. That's all we need to know about it.
Yeah, like how many people know that we did not need to drop either of those nuclear bombs in order to win the war? We just did that to get, to show Khrushchev that we could be tough. How
many people know that NATO, most of its history consisted of funding these far right groups around Europe to do false flag terror attacks, to create a strategy of tension, blaming that on the communists, to keep the country firmly in the Western capitalist sphere. That's what NATO was for years. We took in so many Nazis. We have Operation Paperclip. We have, the Gehlen organization in Germany, which was largely constituted of, Hitler's intelligence apparatus. So this was NATO. And so some people say there's a joke that, like, the Third Reich didn't lose the war. They just relocated.
Yeah.
But that's not the history that Americans know. That's too complicated.
Yeah. So this other thing that we don't have time to discuss, but I discussed it on my interview with Bruce Gagnon, who's a peace activist from Maine, was that RAND report about unbalancing and overextending Russia, which is, basically designed to break it up, and this Dominic Lasordo theory that they're worried about being, colonized, so to speak, more than they want to be imperial. imperialists themselves, probably holds more water. You're familiar with that, right? We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the Red Report, I'm still reading through the whole thing because a lot of it's focusing on like why not other places and why Ukraine is the best opportunity to destabilize Russia. But essentially, that's what the report is. It's going through all of these hotspots around the world, around like Russia's sphere of influence, and asking like, what is the risk to destabilizing this area? What might be Russia's response? What's like the worst case scenario? And in the end, in the summary brief, it was like, well, yes, Ukraine is the highest chance of success. And it's also the highest risk. But if that's the way we want to destabilize and unbalance Russia, funding different efforts in Ukraine, essentially trying to do exactly what we're doing in Ukraine, is the best way to do it, because that's what Russia considers to be their most vital security asset. And so going after that will provoke a response in some way. And an invasion is exactly the sort of overextension that they were talking about.
I'm going to put this comment up on the screen here because I think this might, oh no, this is not the comment. It was this comment. Hold on. Remember I was telling you about that Russian billionaire, that exiled Russian billionaire I was reading who...
yeah, you did. I never did get that reading.
I think this might be the guy. You know, we haven't talked about him. I just remember reading that one thing that he was exiled by Putin and he's in Ukraine, and he's sort of bankrolling Zelensky. And Zelensky was elected on this anti-corruption platform, and he went after all these other oligarchs because Ukraine, and we didn't talk about this, has such a history of corruption, but he didn't go after this guy because he's his patron. I'm assuming that's, you know, this person's name. I don't remember. I only read it the one time. Were you reading? Did you find anything on him?
No, I did not. So I probably shouldn't speak on the matter. But there is a question about, you know, what what is the balance of power in like the Zelensky government, and what are the forces acting on him now?
Yeah. Well, that's what I want to conclude. I want to talk about solutions. So, like, we've already discussed that arming them to the hilt, which is what we're doing right now, is going to lead to a protracted war, because if they didn't have the arms, and apparently Germany or Poland, I think I read that Poland wasn't going to give them MiGs, but now they're going to give them MiGs.
I think the U.S. shut that down.
Oh, they did?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, well, maybe they wanted to. And then
they definitely wanted to, yes.
Yeah. So, you know, and then all these weapons getting in the hands of these neo-Nazis, and these weapons are going to be trafficked. They're going to enter the illegal, you know, arms market. We talked about, you know, what happened when the U.S. went into Syria. So let's talk about the ideal situation, and then maybe talk about why it's maybe unlikely to happen.
Oh, lost you there for a second. Oh. I think you're back now.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I was buffering. Both of our windows were buffering. I hope the audience stayed with us. I was just leaning down to check if my internet connection.
Yeah, I was looking at my router over there.
Right.
You were talking about solutions.
Oh, yes. So Levon from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft said that they should negotiate. And one of the things that he said is that, you know, the Ukraine should agree to be neutral, which I think we've already said that Zelensky has intimated that he's willing to do, that the U.S. end their sanctions. We don't know if the U.S. will do that, that Russia should pay reconstruction costs, that, you know, they should demilitarize Ukraine, which they probably won't agree to, and that they should purge the Nazis from the government, which they probably won't agree to, and recognize Crimea as part of Russia. And he didn't mention those two regions in the Donbass, but I'm assuming that they should be allowed to be independent. So my question to you is, do you think Zelensky is going to be willing to do any of these things? And do you really think that Zelensky has any independence? I mean, I have friends who I've argued with, and a Bernie delegate here in Asheville who's basically said, "Oh, so you think they should give in to Russia? They should give in to the bully. They should do what he wants, as opposed to they're an independent country. They're democratic. They should just the people should decide. Like, where in any country do the people actually decide? I mean, that's so naive. So, they're, in my opinion, these leaders are motivated by staying in power, and he's going to look to whoever he thinks is, going to keep him in power and do what that country wants. What is your thinking on this?
Right. I mean, it's tough to get in anyone's head, like I said, especially like in a foreign country. But Zelensky, he has been willing to negotiate with as far as NATO goes, and he doesn't. Last reporting I saw, which was from 3 days ago, so who knows what's changed.
Yeah.
That he didn't want to compromise the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which that refers to those breakaway republics in the Donbass and also the recognition of Crimea, which to me, those seem like very, very easy things to give up for him.
Right.
Notably because for 8 years, Ukraine has been without those breakaway republics. And like I mentioned earlier, they haven't been doing the necessary steps to reintegrate them as per the Minsk agreements. They've been, keeping the civil war alive. And as far as Crimea, well, the Crimeans, they largely support being part of Russia. They had a plebiscite in 2014 where they voted to be part of Russia, and subsequent opinion polls, if they're to be believed, they say that the Crimeans still largely support that. And so that's really no skin off of Ukraine's nose. And so to me, this seems like a very uh, sort of a straightforward way to end this conflict. But the major problem is that it seems that Zelensky might be holding out for more Western support, for more NATO support, and for whatever reason, he believes that if he puts enough pressure on the United States and the West, that there might be a no-fly zone. If you look at his statements in the that get reported on, at least in Western press, and that are plastered all over cable news, it's that there are a bunch of Ukrainian politicians and Zelensky himself saying that we need a no-fly zone. That's the only way out of this, which is obviously insane. There is no situation in which a no-fly zone gets us closer to stability. It gets us closer to nuclear annihilation, and that's obviously game over for everybody.
Right.
The main thing that we need right now is for the United States to stop with these escalatory measures. Like, the only thing you hear about is whether or not the sanctions are enough, and whether or not we should do a no-fly zone, whether or not we're sending enough weapons, things like that. No, we should be talking about ways to de-escalate. And there's only one way to do that, and that's talking. And that's talking about what Russians have been saying are their security concerns, and what the same thing that they've been saying for the last 30 years. And since U.S. refusal to negotiate is at the root of this whole issue, I don't know how optimistic I am that they'll, come to their senses, because foreign policy isn't really driven by logic and reason so much as internal logics of expansion and our own skewed definitions of security. But that really seems to be the only way out. If the United States went to the table with Zelensky and Putin and the European Union, they could come to an agreement about this. I have no doubts about it. Yeah. It's all about whether or not they have the willingness to do so. And since the war started, Blinken has said that they've cut off top-level communication between the Kremlin and Washington, which is the absolute opposite of what you should be doing. They should be talking about ways to de-escalate. That's right. The only way that this war will end without getting worse than it is.
Well, the thing is, I wonder how much influence the American people have right now, because I've already stated that I think the blob the military industrial intelligence complex there in Washington really wants this war. I think these industries, like the fossil fuel industry, really wants this war. But this is going to be very bad for the American people at some point, because it's not just going to affect the price of gas, which we've already seen go up, but it's also going to affect the price of food. I mean, there's commodities that are being affected here. I don't know that I understand it all, but this protracted war is going to be very bad for the people of all these countries. So the question is, trying to think like a strategist with Biden going into the midterms, do we feel that the American people are going to eventually see that putting all our treasure into this other country? I mean, they've already just canceled the COVID money to put it into Ukraine, and COVID, like all of a sudden, that no more epidemic, no more pandemic, now this is the next new shiny thing that we've got to worry about. So, I mean, do you think that the American people have such a lust? I mean, they seem to have more of a lust for war for this particular country than anything that I've seen, since Vietnam. And I'm that old that I remember protesting that as a little girl. But eventually, are they going to make the connection that this is affecting their day-to-day existence, and maybe we'll have a revised peace movement? Because right now, I don't see, I was actually afraid to go. This was probably the first peace rally that I didn't go to, because I knew that we were calling for, no war, no NATO, and no sanctions. This was before the invasion. We were already planning the Answer Coalition, and a whole bunch of peace groups were planning this, and this was going to be the call. And I'm like, I'm not going to go into the center of Asheville after what Putin just did and call. I mean, they're going to attack me,
Exactly. And it seems to be that the peace movement, the so-called peace movement, I've seen marches down the street all over the internet where people are calling for a no-fly zone. So it's one of the weird times in history where you actually have pro-war marches. Like,
Yeah.
what is that? But I do think that Americans are highly skeptical about U.S. A deep level of like overt U.S. involvement in the region. Polls seem to show that Americans don't want boots on the ground, and for his part, Biden has been clear that he will not put boots on the ground, at least for now. In this context of Ukraine, who knows what's going on in the future? But Americans have also you've seen a lot of reporting about how Americans are supportive of higher gas prices if it means that they're punishing Putin in a public relations I guess offensive. They called it the Putin price hike, which okay. But if you look at that poll closely, you'll see that people making under $30,000 a year, they only support that at 37%, which I still think it's high in my view, especially considering that they're the most vulnerable people, but it's certainly not everybody. And so if you put the squeeze on the American people long enough, then they might not react in an explicitly anti-war way. They might not connect it necessarily to U.S. militarism abroad. They might not, because the media doesn't really tell them that there was an alternative, right? Like they don't say that, yes, Biden put sanctions on Putin to raise your gas prices when he could have, negotiated a peaceful settlement years ago, months ago, weeks ago. He could still do it, but they don't tell people that, and so people might just go along with it. How you can write letters to your local newspaper. Well, some people have been sharing their local papers around the country, and some people are writing in saying, well, I paid so much for gas, but it felt good because it felt like I was helping Ukraine.
Yeah.
And in that sort of situation, it's hard to say whether or not people will eventually grow wise to the real machinations of U.S. policy. The only way that will happen is if we continue to push for alternative voices in the media, push for alternative forms of media. Do your best to get your friends and family out of the corporate media ecosystem and into something that's more healthy,
Right.
into something that gives a holistic view of the world, and that, yes, criticizes America, and yes, they say some things that Vladimir Putin might be saying,
Yeah.
but if you have the media literacy that, I think all God-given adults should have, then you should be able to parse out the nonsense from the actual good stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what alternative media should be for. It should be cultivating a more engaged citizenry, a more a citizenry that thinks deeply about the issues of their country.
Well,
But as long as we have corporate media, it's easy for people to be distracted and bamboozled and diverted.
right. Well, I will say that in order to have media literacy, you have to have critical thinking. And these two things are not really being taught in American public schools anymore, sadly. But that's a whole other show. We have to leave it at that. I want to thank you so much for being with me. I'm going to put up where people can follow you on Twitter, the Green BJ. I'm not even going to talk about what that brings up. And,
It was my IU email, and so they gave it to me.
Okay, really? Okay.
I did think it was kind of funny.
Okay, and here's your publication, Fair Media Watch, that Bryce writes for. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the show tonight. I think it was a really good show, and if you think so too, please share this. You can follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. And right now I'm going live here on Facebook. And so if you're on Facebook watching, please share the show on Facebook. And if you're on YouTube watching, please share the show on YouTube. If you want to share it on Twitter, I would share the YouTube one because that way you get the good graphic. And again, thank you very much, Bryce. And I want to tell everybody in the audience, even though this is not being in a war, this is not a very good slogan. And even though I also found out like a year after I started using it that it's how Lee Camp ends his shows, I still, just out of habit, doing this show for 5.5 years now, want to close by telling everybody to keep fighting.